And tonight we have the amazing, amazing debut author, Belinda Huijuan Tang, in her amazing book, A Map for the Missing. I loved this book. I actually got a copy last spring. I scooped it up. I couldn't wait to read it, and it did not disappoint. So, Belinda, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks for that very enthusiastic introduction.
Thank you. And thank you to the Howe Library Corporation for sponsoring us tonight and for everybody who's listening. If you are interested in this book, you can check out a copy at the library or go to your local bookstore. In this new literary series, check this out. I feature authors that I think you should be reading and listening to and talking about. So before we jump into questions with Belinda, I'm going to read her biography so you get a little bit of a sense, a taste of who she is, and then we're going to jump right in. So Belinda is a 2021 graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was a Truman Capote Fellow and recipient of the Mishner Copernicus Fellowship. She holds a BA from Stanford University and was a 2019 work-study fellow at the Middlebury Breadloaf Writers Conference. Whew, there's a lot going on there. She lived in China from 2016 to 2018, and while there, received an MA from Peking University in Beijing. She currently lives in LA, and this amazing book, look at this beautiful cover, A Map for the Missing, was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize. So congratulations, Belinda. That's so exciting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So tell us, what is your book about?
So A Map for the Missing starts out with Tang Yitian. He's a Chinese American immigrant, and he has been living in the US for 15 years. And suddenly he gets a call from China, from his mom, and his mom tells him that his father, who he is estranged from, who he hasn't spoken to in 15 years, has gone missing back in China. And so the story unfolds in two parts. One part is following Yitian as he goes back to China and searches for his father. And then the second part happens back in the 1970s when we hear about why Yitian and his father were originally estranged.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really loved about this book and that pulled me right in was that backstory with Yitian has the love story as well. There is, right? Han Wen is in there, but also you plunge us right into the Cultural Revolution, right? And sort of how they come together. So I would love to hear about why you decided to pull that in, is that as sort of one of the centerpieces of the book.
Well, it's funny because right now I'm like writing a new book, and it feels like and I had kind of like started it just thinking about it's about scientists, and I'm like 100 pages in, and it's become a love story actually. And so it seems kind of like it might just be something about me as a writer, that at least every part of every novel I'm going to write is going to have a love story component, and that's just something that I have to make peace with. So that might be why I pulled it in. Another component is so Han Wen, the woman that Yitian is in love with when he's young, she represents a different kind of person that was affected by the Cultural Revolution, and a part of that history that I really wanted to make sure was represented on the page. So I originally conceived the story with just Yitian, and he, when we meet him at the beginning of the book, is like, kind of, he's obviously like has a lot of emotional hangups, but in a way he's like living this life as professor. He's gotten to go to college, and he's gotten to do all these things that he really dreamed of. And that is one very rare story of what happens for people who live through this era. And I think a more common story is of Chinese people who lived through this era having their lives really negatively affected. And so I was wondering how to have another character that would kind of portray that part of the history and represent that in the book. And so that was how I originally developed Han Wen as a character.
I love it. Well, I mean, it's funny that you're talking about that you're surprised that love was in there. I mean, I feel like love drives the book from the very beginning even, right? It's his love for his father, for his family, right? I mean, love is what makes some people just get out of bed in the morning, almost all of us. So it felt very natural that it was in there, all of that. So one of the big themes of the book is leaving, as I read it. So, as you said, the book starts and Yitian's father has left. He's sort of disappeared. We see Han Wen was forced to leave her mother, and Yitian himself leaves. He goes to America. First, he goes to university, then he goes to America. So there are lots of people leaving in this book. I would love to hear you talk about that as a theme and how you thought about that as you were writing.
Yeah, leaving was something that was really on my mind because I was thinking about it a lot in the context of immigration. I think so. I started like conceiving this book when I was living in China. And I hadn't started writing yet, but this feeling I had when I was in China was I could not believe that my parents lived here for like 25 plus years of their life and then suddenly decided to leave, right? And they made a voluntary decision to leave when they immigrated to the US. My parents are first generation immigrants from China to the US, I should say. They made a voluntary decision to leave. And I wondered what it would feel like because when they left, they must have known there's a very good chance that they would never come back. They would never go back to the country where they had grown up. And it was so hard for me to conceive of being so certain of the necessity to go somewhere else, that you're willing to say goodbye to all of the places that you've grown up with, all the people that you've loved. And so I was really fascinated in exploring that concept of like a voluntary departure and what would drive that and how does it feel to, cause yourself this own heartbreak that you're agreeing to when you decide to leave.
Yeah. I mean, I think you really express that pain very well, but also that return. You give us a chance to see what it's like for Yitian to come back, right? This is in the very beginning of the book. And he comes back and he sees this life that where he grew up with very different eyes. And what I found so interesting was the way that people would say to him, oh, you have everything. You are the big famous, academic. You made it to America. You're the best of the best. And he looks at them thinking some of his old friends are living in fancy houses, right? And like, but you guys have a life because I'm really poor in America, right? And you see this contradiction of like, it always looks better on the other side. And you balance that so well. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, one thing that I was interested in exploring is like this idea or this feeling that when you decide to immigrate, you kind of like also agree to a sort of non-belonging in both countries, right? Like we see, and a lot of the book doesn't really take place in the US, and that wasn't the story I was primarily interested in, but we do see glimpses of how lonely Yitian feels in America. And then we also, when we're in China, like we see how much he doesn't belong because even though he feels like such an intense sense of longing for this home, this place that was once his home, it's moved on when he isn't there and it's become a different place and he doesn't totally fit in there anymore. And he still views himself kind of like as this person who's still striving to make it, who's really struggling to live in the US and has a lot of difficulties. And there's just an incredible dissonance between his self-image and how people in the village are viewing him because he's left. And I think that's kind of one of the discrepancies that arises from immigration, the sense that in both places, even this place that you long for, where you think you may be understood, which is Yitian's hometown, that feeling of belonging is gone.
Yeah. So as you were speaking, I looked up one of my favorite passages in here. Really talks about this sort of exactly what you're talking about, what it feels like to be moving to America. On page 95, I'll just read it out loud. You write, there were minuscule differences between the accents of their village and surrounding ones, created and solidified over hundreds of years. Even Baija village or Five Groves people didn't sound the same as those from Tang family village. How remarkable, Yitian sometimes thought, that now he lived in a country where people couldn't even hear the difference between Chinese and Korean. So there you see the very stark contrast of he's living in America and people don't know the difference between Chinese and Korean. And yet here he comes home and people can tell the difference, tiny difference, right? Of people living, 20 miles apart, 30 miles apart. I love that you emphasize language in that way. I would love to hear you just talk about how because you talk about language a lot in this book, how were you thinking about that as you were writing this?
Well, language, I think, comes up, as you said, in a lot of different ways in the book. In that passage you just read, something I was just thinking about is, again, like that, what is left what is lost with immigration, right? And it's like the nuances of who we are. There's so much specificity to Yi Tian's personal history, and a lot of that comes from the language he speaks, right? There's dialect of what he speaks versus what people in the capital might speak. And there are all these differences, and he moves to a place where all of that kind of gets erased or becomes kind of molded into like one big mass of history that has no distinctions within it. And I like the idea of language there as a way of holding on or describing the kind of specificity that Yi Tian may have grown up with, and using that like as a counter to this kind of amalgamizing that is happening to Yi Tian when he's in the US. More broadly, I was thinking about ways to incorporate Chinese into this book, because that was something that I thought a lot about when I was in China. Like, it was amazing to me. I got way better at Chinese while I was there. And it was amazing to me that through getting better at language, I was able to access parts of my family history and access like emotional closeness because of, increased proficiency in that language. And so language was acting as a conduit for me. And so in the book too, I tried to talk about language as a way of knowing people better. So in the passage you read, it's about like an intimacy with the place that he's from, like knowing these very small nuances in language, with the way that he speaks as soon as he returns to his ancestral home. That's a form of intimacy with his home. And so those were all the things I was trying to do with language there.
Yeah, I love that, because you also show how he's an outsider with language. There was a passage in here, I don't have it marked, but where he was saying he learned how to laugh at jokes. Like he would laugh with everybody else and sort of take their cues, even though he didn't understand the jokes, right? It's like when you learn a new language, you might understand every word being said, but you don't understand the nuance and why it's funny, right? And you capture that.
Right. And you have to kind of become a different person in order to like blend in and assimilate using that new language, right? Like, who knows if Yi Tian would have actually found that joke funny. Right. But in the moments, like the assimilation takes priority over like the demonstration of any personality.
Right. It hurt me when you wrote, he laughed, he would learn what kind of laugh to give too, based on the social cues around him. I mean, yes, it was just, yes, there you go, being an immigrant. Okay, so another passage that I want to talk to you about a little bit different is books and stories, because Yi Tian is very close to his grandfather, who is sort of an endless storyteller, right? He's always telling stories, and he's telling stories every night. And on page 32, you write just this, I'll read just this one paragraph. They kept going until his grandfather finished the 5,000 years contained in the 24 histories, volumes that he'd memorized as a matter of safety. It was gambling to rely on words stored on paper, his grandfather said. Books could be destroyed. A small army, sometimes Japanese, more often Chinese, your own people, finding it easiest to stage a betrayal, could tear through a village, conscript the men to march further with them, leaving the fields intact, but piling all the books to be burned. Even those illiterate men knew how powerful words could be. There you go, on books and stories, that, the power of words. I loved that paragraph, and I just want to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, so that paragraph is based on, real life and stuff that happened in my family. Like the burning of books is something that is like really well traced throughout Chinese history, and especially during the period of the Cultural Revolution. So much history was destroyed because it was viewed as like dangerous, and it was viewed as kind of counter to what like the Communist Party wanted the nation to focus on. And I think the fact that like in so many autocratic regimes in the US right now, that so much attention is paid to books and trying to control that, to like control what people are given access to, is kind of a testament to the power that people see in books and the power that people see books have in order to, make people more open-minded or change ideas. And that to some people is very dangerous. So when my dad was growing up, he had a grandfather, like the grandfather in this book, was really influential in his upbringing and who really instilled in him this love of reading and culture. And one of the things that my dad would always talk about in his grandfather was that he had memorized the 24 histories, which is this huge, insanely long volume of Chinese history word for word because they did not have access to books when he was younger, and he knew it was dangerous. He knew that the book was in danger of being banned. And so he had memorized that all the history in there. And to me, that sounded amazing. Like, I have no memory anymore. Like, I rely on looking things up on my iPhone or looking things up on the internet for everything. And I wonder just what it would feel like to place such importance that you're willing on books and the information contained in them, that you would go through such lengths to remember them, to physically remember them in order to retain that information.
Yeah. But then you contrast that with, right, the importance of books and words on paper with the importance of identity cards. And there's this moment very early on where Ye Tian realizes he doesn't have his Chinese identity card. He only has his American card, right? And he's sort of stuck in the past. I thought that was a symbol of he had everything that was old because he didn't even have the right card, right, anymore. He had the old one. He had never upgraded. And so there you are, it's like no books, but we need all this paper and this bureaucracy, and you have to take this paper test and move on. Right. So I thought that was a really interesting contrast that you had in there. Did you think about that, or, how did that come to be?
That's so interesting. You know what? I hadn't thought about that. And you're the first person who's kind of brought up that contrast to me. So thank you for that. It's so interesting to think about what kinds of words are kind of approved by the government, what kinds are actually utilized by them in order for that, for them to achieve their purposes, of testing people through the college entrance exam, or testing people through, keeping track of people through identity cards, and what kinds are considered by them to be dangerous. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I love that you really took us through this, the college entrance exams, right? And it was like this one test that could change everybody's life, anybody's life, right? Anyone could sign up for it. And all the kids who wanted to go to college had to go to sort of a bigger city. They were in the small village and they'd go to a bigger city to take this test. And it just sounded terrifying to me. Like, I can't imagine having to do that, and the pressure, the amount of pressure on these kids. And we see that you describe it so well. How did you dig into that pressure?
Well, it was also sounded terrifying to me. I remember when I was in high school taking the SAT, and that exam is probably like 10% of the importance of China's college entrance exam. And I remember going to the exam site in the morning and having a panic attack, so a lot of it was just trying to reconnect with my high school self and remember how awful that was. But yeah, like I said, this exam is kind of everything for Chinese young people. It certainly is now, and it was then. In China, the college entrance is only determined by this one test. So there's nothing else. You can't write a good essay in order to make up for it. You can't have good grades to make up for it. It's just your score on this test, and it takes place once a year over 3 days. And that's the only chance you get. And I think, all of us have gone through, test taking, and it's not hard to imagine the kind of anxiety and panic that might induce in someone.
Oh my God. But I've taken tests, but not like that. I mean,
right. Exactly.
That is a whole other level. And I just you just put us in the world, and what Ye Tian had to do to get there, to, literally get to the room, was just beautiful. And I really encourage all of you to read this book, if not just for that, what a person is willing to do for a better life, right? For a chance, for a dream. I just thought you captured that so well, no matter where they live, right? I love these stories of people fighting for that moment. And I thought you just captured it so well. So I wanted to ask you a question about the book itself, like the printing. So you have some graphs printed in here. There's some little tiny equations. You don't have to read the equations or the graphs to understand the book, just to be clear, right? And there's, right, and you also have people's names, and you talk about their names. You have Chinese characters in here. What did your editors think about all of these, these sort of additions?
Have you edited a book? You must have, if you're asking this question. You saw this and you're like, oh my gosh.
Yes, I want to know.
Yeah, it was, when we were doing the print version of the book, there was a lot of checking in, and my edit, like every few days when they're finalizing the I can't remember what it's called, the final pass, whatever. They were like, oh, does this look the way you want it to? We have to have someone redraw this. Does this look good? Because I'd drawn a version in like Microsoft Word myself when I was working on the book, but obviously it was like too amateur to get printed. But where we like really got into trouble, or where things got complicated, was when we were recording the audiobook, because
oh my God.
And it never occurred to me, but I was getting all these emails from the audiobook producer being like, how should we pronounce this? Like, for the book, should we just say like, see, there's a figure on the page? And so that it got quite complicated for that.
Yeah. Well, so what was the answer? How did they pronounce it in the audiobook?
There are ways to verbalize that math. Like when I was thinking back to, when like my math professors would be saying the equations as they would write it. So I gave them readings. I recorded stuff for them. That was just that. But I imagine if you are encountering this and you haven't read math in a long time, it would be quite confusing to you.
But you can totally skip it. You don't need to read.
Right. Yeah.
Like you talk through them. They were just sort of visuals that I thought were amazing and helpful, but you definitely don't need them. So no one should be intimidated by that question.
And there's not that many of them. There's like 4 in the entire book. So you just have to make sure one for every 100 pages.
Yeah. It just stuck out like, oh my God, that's like an editor's nightmare.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you, before we sort of switch gears into asking more about writing, so as we get towards the end, not a spoiler, but one of the big themes, and one of the themes that the characters are working towards through the entire book, is forgiveness. They're looking for forgiveness. They're hoping they can find forgiveness, right? In themselves, from other people. How did you think about forgiveness in this book and in the journeys that your characters take?
Yeah, I really like that you said they're looking for forgiveness in themselves, because I think that was one of the strongest things that I was thinking about. Etienne, I think his biggest like inner turmoil throughout this book is how much he is unable to forgive himself. For things that happen early on when he's a child, which I won't give away, but several things happen. Some sacrifices are made for him. And I think he feels an enormous sense of shame and enormous inability to forgive himself. And it was so interesting to me, because alongside Etienne's journey for self-forgiveness, his father kind of wants Etienne to forgive him, and I was just struck by how we could create these narratives around what kind of forgiveness we need to find and who won't forgive us ever, that kind of don't make space for the grace that others show for us. And I wanted to kind of lay those out side by side, Etienne searching for his own forgiveness while his father searching for an entirely different kind of forgiveness, to demonstrate how kind of they're missing each other so much in what kind of forgiveness they're looking for.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And very hard to write about. So I want to switch gears for the last few minutes here, to ask you, because many of our listeners are writers, and they all want to know, what was the hardest part about getting this book published? This is your debut, this beautiful book. What was the hardest part on the journey?
I think the hardest part was getting started. And I would say, I think it's so interesting, as I think probably this answer to this question is going to reveal a lot about myself. But what I really struggle with is this idea of self-doubt. And I think creating a book is so hard for people who have a lot of self-doubt, because you're creating an imaginary world and asking people to believe in it. And when you don't believe in it, it's like the slightest pin in that bubble can just shatter everything. And so when I was first starting out, it was so hard for me to imagine creating a world that even I could believe in as the writer of it, much less that readers could believe in. And as I was conceiving the novel, every time I would like think of something a character would do, I would say, there'd be like another equally opposite force in my head saying like, well, no one will believe that, that would happen or that these two characters would do these things. And so I was always struggling with just getting started with telling myself you could believe in this fictional world and write it. So that was the most difficult part for me.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you did find the courage to believe in it and then you got through it. And so did you start this book? You said while you were in China. So was it 2016? Like you've been working on it for 4 or 5 years?
I started writing it in 2019 in January. I remember it was actually it was around January 1st of 2019 when I was home with my family over the holidays. So I started thinking about this book, like pretty much as soon as I was writing fiction, I kind of knew like, oh, I want this to be my first novel. But I had this feeling like I wasn't ready to write it yet. And I think that was probably right, that I was really far from being ready to write it. And so probably I was thinking about it in my head for, I don't know, like 3 or 4 years before I started actually writing.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about that because I think a lot of people see, a shiny, beautiful book and they think it just like popped out, right? But actually, no, it was incubating in your head for 3-4 years, right? As you're like probably imagining characters or scenes or, what you want to think about, talk about in the book. Is that right? I mean, little pieces are coming to you.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, now I'm like writing a book, like I have much more pressure on myself and I'm like, I need to finish the book by, I don't know, right now my goal is like in a year, I want to have the draft finished. And I do look back on that time when I like took things much more slowly just because I didn't think I had the ability to write a book. And I was really like just daydreaming about the book all the time. And it seems kind of nice to me. It feels kind of romantic that, I had the images in my head and I would go on a train ride and I would think, oh, I should put that in the book. And that was like a really nice way for the story to unfold.
Yeah, I love that. So what kind of advice do you have for new writers or aspiring writers?
I would say the piece of advice that I'm trying to give to myself most of the time right now, and so I'd pass this on to others, is to trust that like time solves a lot of writing problems. I think there's a sense that I have, when I'm trying to meet my daily word count and I can't figure out this issue, like I will get so frustrated with myself and like be tearing my hair out. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened. And the next day after a good night's sleep or after a few nights of sleep, I've gone to the same thing and been like, oh, the answer to this is apparent. And same thing that I've, had while like structuring stories and structuring this last novel and figuring out where to put stuff, like issues that at points felt intractable to me suddenly became tractable with just, a few days or a few weeks passing. So yeah, what I'm trying to tell myself is to, keep writing and have faith that, the same mind that came up with most of these stories and created these problems has the ability to think through them, and not to get too frustrated by the thinking process.
Yeah. So when you are frustrated, do you look back on a map for the missing and you're like, oh yeah, I did this before, and like look up specific passages?
I won't look up specific passages, but I do have it in my head, like, oh, you've written a novel before, you can write another one.
That's great. That's great. And what about, so this is a new question that I want to ask because I recently became aware that all different writers have different ideas on drafts and like what they call a draft. So like this one person was telling me last weekend that every 30 days she calls whatever she's working on a new draft. Versus like I sort of, whenever I have a whole new idea, I'm like, oh, that's a new draft, even if it's just, cutting a page or something. How do you think about drafts as you're writing?
Wow, I love that. If both of those strike me as like way more generous to you as a writer, like ideas of what a draft is. I have such, I think, really strict rules on drafts. Like I would have to finish an entire, 0 to page 400, whatever, the full page.
Wow. Okay.
In order to consider it a draft. But I don't like that. It puts too much pressure on me. I think like when you're in the process of getting to page 400, it's like you feel like trash. You're like, don't even have a single draft yet. And it seems much more generous to say, I've been working on this for 30 days. That counts as a new draft.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of brilliant. I might use it
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah,
Anyway, Belinda Huijuan Tang, thank you so much for joining me today. A Map for the Missing is her debut, long listed again for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize, and just brilliant. If you haven't read it, go get a copy. Check it out of your library, check it out of the Howe Library, or go to your local bookstore and buy a copy. Thank you so much for joining us for this third installment of Check This Out. We're so happy to have you. Thank you to the Howe Library Corporation and to our amazing producers tonight, Jared Tennish and Megan Coleman. Thank you for all of your hard work. Join us again soon. Next up in the series, we have Elena Armas coming, Spanish Love Deception, and her New York Times bestseller, The American Roommate Experiment. I will see everybody on November 9th. Thanks again, Belinda. Have a good night.
Thanks, Rachel.